In commemoration of this year's International Day of Persons with Disabilities, which aims to promote an understanding of and mobilize support for the dignity, rights, and well-being of persons living with disabilities, the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, reminds us on the need to protect the rights of children living with disabilities. According to UNICEF, as many as 240 million children living with disabilities all around the world are being denied basic rights. By this figure, 1 in 10 children worldwide suffers from denial of basic human rights. UNICEF stated this in a report on Thursday titled Fact Sheet: The world's nearly 240 million children living with disabilities are being denied basic rights, which was released ahead of the International Day of Persons Living with Disabilities. Our guest this morning is Rose Mordi, a British-trained business administrator and founder, as well as president of the Down Syndrome Foundation of Nigeria, an NGO that caters for children and adults with Down syndrome in Nigeria and other West African countries. Good morning, madam.
Good morning.
Have you in the studio.
It's a pleasure being here today.
Thank you very much. The report from UNICEF is a bit weighty, isn't it? 240 million children all over the world. How much of this affects Nigeria? And do you know, in precise terms, the sort of basic rights that are being denied children living with disabilities?
I think we actually should not concentrate only on children,
Okay.
but all persons with disability. Though we could start from the children, because the basic rights are needed for children before they can grow and thrive to become full adults. But I think the information that had been gathered and the statistics that they have got to use, I think is collected from the more organized societies. We have more in this country. Unfortunately, we do not have data to back it up.
That's right.
But from all indication, I think children in Nigeria suffer more than children in other parts of the world.
Those with disabilities.
Disability.
Yeah. And now narrowing it down into particular disabilities, you work mostly with Down syndrome affected ailments in terms of children. Could we possibly get some sort of more enlightenment as to what exactly that is about? I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding and misconception on really what Down syndrome is. Yes, genetic chromosome disorder, which of course affects developmentally and maybe intellectually in terms of delays as well. But what more do our viewers need to know about Down syndrome, please?
Well, let me start with telling us what Down syndrome is before I say what Down syndrome isn't. Down syndrome is a genetic disorder from birth. At conception, the male reproductive cell is meant to have 24 chromosomes. 23. And this female, 23. At conception, when they fuse together, that initial cell should have 46. But during the pairing process, at the 21st pairing, an extra chromosome springs up. So as the cell is developing and dividing and growing into a human being, it's growing with 47 chromosomes as against 46 the rest of us have. And that single extra chromosome is what predisposes a child to be born with a condition called Down syndrome. Researches are still ongoing because nobody knows how it came about, if it's from the father or it's from the mother, but the fact that this child is born with an extra chromosome, and that is what predisposes them to have that condition. It's not an ailment. It's not a disease. It's not something somebody contracted. It's not something that somebody did to someone. In our climb, everything that is not right, we attribute it to some spiritual thing and so on. It is not. But the fact that they have an extra chromosome in all the cells, and chromosomes are the blueprint of who we grow up to be. You would see a child, it looks like the father or the mother is because of that trait, the blueprint that the child has. And that is the reason why a lot of awareness has to be created to debunk the misconception and the superstition that people have about them. Now, let me explain what they are predisposed to, first medically. A child with Down syndrome that is born with Down syndrome would be predisposed to a lot of medical conditions. The most serious one is the congenital heart defect, which about 60% of them have what we commonly call a hole in the heart. They are also born with diabetes. They could be predisposed to Alzheimer's, early onset of Alzheimer's disease. Some of them would have quite a lot of medical conditions that need to be addressed early enough. And if it is not addressed, of course, most of them would die young. But thankfully, there's a lot that have been put in place medically to take care of those that need medical attention. But then let me also explain about the physical features, because that's why when it was first discovered, they used to call them Mongols. They call it Mongolism because they attribute it to the features that the people in Mongolia have with the slanting eyes and so on. They are born with slanting eye that slants outwards and upwards. They have a low nasal bridge. Most of them have low set ears. They have weak muscle tone. Most of them, also, all of them have speech defects. The reason being that they are born with smaller mouth cavity. And then, of course, most of the things you would find on their palm, you would find that they have 2 creases as against 3 that the rest of us have. And then they have what we call sandal toe. The big toe is separated from the main toe. But then there are some who might not have all those stigmata, the physical stigmata, but they still have Down syndrome. So what needs to be done is to carry out chromosomal tests to confirm that they do have. And then, of course, because of that extra chromosome, most of them have what we call mental retardation. I wouldn't want to call it mental retardation. I would want to say they have learning disability. So those are the things that we know about them. As I said, researches are still ongoing. Even though it was discovered over more than 100 years ago, and that's why they call Down syndrome, named after the first doctor that discovered it, that's Dr. Langdon Down, who discovered it in the year 1886. But then in 1959, a French geneticist, Lejeune, was able to identify the extra chromosome.
All right. I mean, talk to us about the education of people, especially children with Down syndrome and those living with disabilities. You said it shouldn't just be about children, but then I'm aware that I'm not sure if there are specific schools for children with Down syndrome, but I know that I've heard of cases of parents who think that the advice that maybe special school should be, is what will be best suitable for them. It's not what they need. They think that they can manage with other students in normal schools. Is this something that you encounter, and what would be your thoughts regarding that?
Ideally, the best situation is for them to be in the mainstream educational setup. Okay. In the best of climes, they are there, but then they have support workers to help them along. Because if they are not included in the mainstream schools, there would be stigmatization. Down syndrome, incidentally, is not the only learning disability that we have. It falls under the broad umbrella of learning disability. People also with autism, some on certain spectrum, also have learning disability. People with cerebral palsy, some of them also, quite a number, a broad range of people with disability. I would actually personally recommend that the situation in which they are accepted in the mainstream school, of course with special support, and that is what obtains in the Western world. It helps them to learn and to compete with others, and also for them to be fully integrated and to break the stigmatization. But because if they are put in a special school, there is that tendency of people stigmatizing on them. But then, having said that, in our society, such provision had not been made. And therefore, there is the need to have a special school with specially trained educators and other social workers. And of course, taking care of them requires a multidisciplinary team, not just education alone. Like I said, quite a number of them are born with different types of medical conditions. Some of them are short-sighted, they have short-sightedness, they have speech defect. A lot of them also would be slow in so many things, in reading and writing and a lot of things. So it needs a very long range of people who have specialization in different areas to take care of their needs. So that, to me, the answer I would say is yes and no. In Nigeria, no provision had been made for that. So therefore, they now need to be placed in special schools. But having said that, when we talk about special school, we also need to explain that it has to be special school taking care of their unique needs, because it would not make sense to put them with different types of disability, maybe people with visual impairment, or people with maybe hearing impairment, and so on, because it might not be able to do well with them.
Right. Now, Ma'am Mordi, very important work you're doing there. We have to highlight that. Of course, we are having this conversation in commemoration of the rights of the child, which, I mean, we all know in 1989, the world leaders adopted the UN's Convention of the Rights of the Child, which, of course, very strong 4 statutes there. Could we just talk about some of these rights that children with disabilities should enjoy? And are Nigerians, bringing it back here, sensitized enough to be able to offer and address these needs for children here?
I agree with you. The UNCRPD, which is the United Nations Convention for the Rights of People with Disability, there are about 33 articles. And Articles 23, 24, and 27 talks about the need for people or children, if we may want me to address children specifically with disability, should enjoy. That's education, health, and employment. In the Sustainable Development Goal also, that has 17 goals, number 3, number 4, number 7 also talks about the same thing. That's education, health, and employment. And these are things they had been denied of for so long. A lot of them do not have access to basic medical needs that they have to be met. A lot of them are not in school. Most of them are not even given the opportunity to work. And these are things that need to be addressed frontally. And I want to go back to people with intellectual disability, because we have different clusters. Somebody will say, oh, I have seen someone with disability who has gone to school, has been employed. Yes, they are. People with visual impairment, they go to school, they work. People with possibly a hearing impairment do the same. But I am yet to see people with intellectual disability who had been given the opportunity to even access education, talk less of giving them employment. But they can be employed. A lot of them can be trained. I would use my foundation as an example, because we've been on for the last 20 years, and we have been able to help a lot of families. We have trained them on academics and vocational skills and other things that they would need to go into the employment market. But not one of them has been employed, given employment. And this is what it obtains. I would say it cuts across every region in the world. Most of them are denied those three basic needs that they are entitled to.
Education,
health and employment.
How will you, in specific terms, assess the intervention of Nigerian government, either at the federal level or the state level? I'm aware, personally, that a few years ago, for Lagos State, I'm aware of an intervention fund. I think at that time, around 2016 or thereabout, a 500 million disability, fund. There was even a day in celebrating the Lagos Day on May the 27th. It was essentially devoted to celebrating people with special needs, and disabilities. And I'm sure you also know that at the time, I can't recall now if he's still the head of the Lagos State Agency for Disability. This is somebody who's also have some degree of disability, which in my opinion probably helps, because if you feel it, you can know what to propose to government, etc. So 20 years of your own foundation, and then also assessing in general terms, how do you think government has responded, in terms of intervention, in terms of, cushioning the effects of the problems that you have highlighted here today?
I must give kudos to Lagos State government, because Lagos State government happens to be the first state in Nigeria to sign the disability bill into law. And they had actually been endeavoring to make sure that people with disability are brought into the mainstream of whatever is happening. But unfortunately, I think we are like using the fire brigade approach in that. I happen to have been on the board of the Lagos State Disability Affairs Office a couple of years back. And there were a lot of things put in place. Yes, that fund that you talked about was set aside, was given to them. It was a one-off thing. Okay. And I think with that, after the family has used it, what happens? Nothing. The way I am looking at it is that we need to address it properly. Take care of their basic needs, train them, offer them employment, and that's all that I think needs to be done. Even the federal government, thank goodness, I think early this year, I believe, the disability bill, was it last year, was signed into law. But the implementation is what we are still awaiting, because it hasn't come on stream at the moment. And that is what we want done in Nigeria, for it to really take effect fully.
Right, and we, of course, all wait with bated breath from that happening, because that's very important. But talking about waiting as well, and still circling around the issue of the rights of children and even adults with disabilities. We've talked about sensitizing the public, but how much knowledge do even the children or individuals living with disabilities understand about their own rights? And I understand that that could be a tricky question, given the existing condition and situation, but who is advocating on their behalf in terms of letting them become more aware of those rights?
What we are doing right now, we are training them to become self-advocates. We can't always be talking on their behalf. And there is a slogan we use, nothing for us without us. You cannot be talking for them. You cannot take decision for them. They have their rights. They should be taught to know their rights and demand for their rights. And that is what we are doing presently. As a matter of fact, we have a set of self-advocates who have been trained, who speak up for themselves and make their demands. And this is something that needs to be replicated all along in all the clusters. I think it is wrong for other people to take decisions for adults, and most of them are adults. But you start training them as children so that when they become adults, they can now start advocating for themselves, because they can think, They have feelings like the rest of us. They know what they need, but they are not given the opportunity to voice their needs. And that is the problem that we are facing presently.
How do organizations like yours address the issue of the fraudulent persons who go about pretending to have some disability, and raising money, which exactly, because at the end of the day, it rubs off badly on those who actually need support, and they are not just limited to the streets alone. I've edited a newspaper in Nigeria before that did an award-winning article about the Pacheli School for the Blind, and it turned out that 2 individuals in that school were not blind. Absolutely, it was that article won a major award. It turned out that 2 students in the school, were discovered not to be blind. They were pretending all along because there was provision for some kind of support for them to go to school. I mean, it was a strange discovery.
That is strange.
But then, whose fault is it? I think that's the question we should ask.
Absolutely.
Is the fault of the system? There has to be some structure put on ground to check everyone that comes in. If there are organizations that take care of this specific disability, they must have certain structures on ground to check, to know that everyone who comes in there passes those tests, to be sure. Because I would not blame, though I blame these people who pretend, and I think they are a product of our system and the society, but I also blame those who take care of them. Why did they not carry a due process to check, to know? You have doctors, you have ophthalmologists, you have people who can know whether somebody is blind or not. So why was this not done? So these are things that we need to check. Because when we talk about it, I think there's a lot of responsibility on every single one of us. Every citizen of this country has a responsibility to make sure that the right thing is done. There are a lot of people who go about pretending to be who they are not.
To be challenged,
To be challenged. I have heard stories of people sitting down, begging. They say they cannot see or they cannot walk. Meanwhile, there's nothing wrong with them. But that one also, I think, is a product of our society. Possibly.
You're right.
The system has not taken care of their needs, and that's the only way out.
You're right.
Though that does not justify what they do.
Just to also, put you this information, if you don't mind. There's also a bit of connivance, in all this. There was a story of a school principal, a public school, who accepted or who actually introduced a supposedly blind person to the students, and this person will come to the school, was actually going around the schools and will tell his, fanciful, emotion-laden stories, how he had an accident and blah, blah. And people will be contributing money, teachers and students. It turned out, and they discovered later, it turned out that he was not blind. He's been, scamming people with that kind of, even in educational institutions. I mean, things happen. So I'm hoping that on a day like this, that is meant to draw attention to the actual people who need this thing, I hope that there will be a kind of, direct message, to people so that those who are profiteering, from these sort of conditions, will not continue to do so and will get apprehended, and
Absolutely.
Stuff.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And I think our system needs to be overhauled. We have a lot that we are lacking in our system. And these are things, that's why I said that I think it is the responsibility of every citizen of this country to take up this project. And I call it project because anything to do with disability is something that we all need to address. Remember, disability is no respecter of anyone. Each and every one of us could be disabled, could have disability one time or the other. Even when you are still okay, as you grow old, Maybe you could have an accident. Age could tell on you and you develop one kind of disability. You could have visual impairment and so on. And therefore, we need now to start planning ahead. And that is, to me, the responsibility for every human being. You have to look out for your own brother. Think about not just yourself, because you're okay today. You don't know if tomorrow you might not be okay. So have you put the right structure on ground to take care of the time you might need help given to you? So those are things that we need to look at.
Very well said, Ma'am Mordi. So I want to go back to those fact sheets the UNICEF released. Extremely comprehensive, I must say, and of course very detailed about so many different areas that people probably just don't pay so much attention to. But we've been talking in terms of our last points. It's been more economic. People trying to pose as having a disability to benefit something. But I want to look at the flip side of it, where you also have, this report talked about impoverished persons as well, who don't have access to even information. We, of course, have been able to sit here and talk about it. Somebody could be sitting at home benefiting from this, but then there's somebody who doesn't even have a TV. Let's talk about the costs of living with a disability when you are impoverished, where you are actually cut off from even the luxury of information. How do such people deal with that?
I think disability generally works hand in hand with poverty. Unless someone is privileged, possibly to be born into a comfortable family, when someone has disability, they are denied of virtually every right. And it's not just a person with disability. The entire family is affected. And most of the time, it's the mother that has to carry the brunt of it. And that's why in our local parlance in Africa, in Nigeria, when a child is good, it belongs to the father. When it's bad, it's the mother's child. So when a child has disability, the whole burden is on the mother. And for that reason, the mother's life comes to a total, complete stop. Cannot even afford to take care of the needs of this child. And most disabilities require a lot of money to take care of. And very few families, even the average family, can afford to take care of the needs of people with disability. Let me use maybe somebody with visual impairment who would need to use Braille to learn. Where would and the costs they run into, some of them run into millions or hundreds of thousands of naira. How many families can afford that? Or people who have hearing impairment, they need hearing aid. Where would they have the funds? And then let me use people with intellectual disability. A lot of them have so many medical conditions that cost a lot to be taken care of. Where would the funds come from? That is where the government comes in. We are taxpayers. And I think provision should be made to take care of their needs, particularly their health needs. From there, because if they are not well and they are not alive, you can't do anything for them. You have to make sure that they are well. And this is where Lagos State comes in. They made it mandatory that people with disability should have free medical attention, but it's not happening. You go to the different medical setup, they ask you to pay. And because of that, a lot of families resort to quacks, and it is wrong. And I think that's where we should start from. The government should rise up to its responsibility to make sure that they put the right structure on ground medically to take care of the needs of families that have people with disability.
I'm wondering if you would like to share with us what brought you personally into this. Is it a personal encounter? Is it something that, I mean, I know that it takes a whole lot to have to deal with situations like this. In your own case, what triggered it?
That's a question I've been asked so many times. I happen to be a parent. My last child, who is 34, was born with this condition called Down syndrome here in Nigeria. And when I discovered she has it, and I was the one who discovered, because I had my other children abroad. And there we were, during antenatal, we are taught about different things that could happen. And I remember when I was having my first child, Down syndrome happens to be one of the issues we discussed during the antenatal classes. And it's stuck at the back of my mind. I didn't know until I maybe more than 10 years down the line, I came to have my last child when we returned back to Nigeria. The child was brought to me and dropped there. She was prim as at the time I had her, because I had her through CS. They kept her away from me for about 4 days, kept her in the nursery for a while, and I kept insisting I wanted to see my child. Somehow, I think it's that instinct, the sixth sense that mothers have. Somehow I felt there was something wrong with the child. I kept insisting, and then they brought her during siesta, dropped her by my side, and then I just suddenly woke up. I saw the baby there. I looked at her. Her face just hit me right. She had all the features. Her own is a classic thing. I picked her up. I looked at her. Every single stigmata was there. She had a very low muscle tone. Her neck couldn't hold for the first 9 months of her life. They had to put a collar on her. I looked at all the features, and I saw all the features that I had seen in more than 10 years down the line. I called the nurse who was at the bay. I called her, I said, could you come and have a look at this baby? She came, looked at the baby. Oh, she's such a pretty baby. I said, yes, I know. I said, look at her again. Is there anything different about her? She looked. I said, nothing. So I started pointing out all these features to her. She looked at the baby, looked at me, looked at the baby again, looked at me. And then, are you a doctor? I said, no, I'm not, but I'm a mother. She smiled. She didn't say yes, she didn't say no. She just walked away. It was then it dawned on me that she didn't even know about what is called Down syndrome. And I became very hysterical. They had to call the pediatrician and all other doctors who were in the team. They came in, and in all fairness, the pediatrician had written their DS and put a question mark and didn't say anything. She said that I was the first mother who ever noticed the baby at birth. That usually she would see it, she wouldn't say anything, she would just note it down in the case notes. And then maybe later on, when the problems start developing, when they come back, they start advising them and so on. And that was the day I made up my mind. I said, I wouldn't want other families to go through this. I said, I must do something about it. But though it took me nearly 14 years before I set up the foundation, because I needed to get my other children to grow up and leave home before I could start. And that was the reason why the foundation came into being.
Right, very noble work, and thank you so much for sharing that with us, Ma'am Mordi. Of course, we're better to understand the intricacies of dealing with the situation, but very briefly, because before we round up, because you touched on something, we were talking about rights and costs, but we were focusing on the people with disabilities. What about the parents, the emotional needs of the mothers and the parents of those with children with these needs? Is that being taken care of here?
Here, you mean in Nigeria?
Yes, please. Yes.
No. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things we do in the foundation. We carry out counseling services for parents because we've heard stories of these children being abandoned. A lot of the parents, I mentioned earlier, it's mainly the mothers who really go through this stressful situation where the children are concerned. Quite a lot of times, it is what causes a breakup in the family. The father would either take a walk or would ask the mother to leave with the child. They would blame the mother and say they don't have it in their family, that is the fault of the mother, and so on. So we take the whole family, but we take both the father and the mother and the larger family. We counsel them, because we know the emotional needs that they have, and therefore we have to meet. And if you do not carry the family along, you can't do much for the child. And that's one of the things we do in our foundation. And I think that is something also that the government and possibly other organizations need to do. They need to address the emotional needs of the family, especially the mothers.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Mordi. I mean, it's been an enlightening session with you, sharing perspectives with us. Thank you for coming to the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.